welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be with you here today, where we're basically going to discuss the future of fashion. Now, I realise when we spoke about the future of fashion, that is such a huge statement to just say we're going to talk about the future. But that is anything, I think, from sustainable fashion, pre-loved fashion, secondhand fashion, what fashion will look like in 10, 20, 50 years' time. It's something that I think comes up a lot. And I wondered, to kick things off, was there a defining moment where you realised the fashion industry itself and the clothes you're wearing potentially is having a huge impact on the planet and the future of our planet? It might not have been one moment, but it might have been like a series. But yeah, did any of you have that spark moment where it sort of changed in you?
My first job, well, it was a sort of work experience thing at the end of high school, was in a big vintage warehouse in Birmingham, and my job was to steam the shirts and hang them and fold, and you know the drill. And just the sheer volume of clothing that would come in every day in deliveries to this warehouse just blew my mind. I didn't realize this many clothes existed in the world, let alone in this one warehouse that was sorting and cleaning. And it started to make me feel really uncomfortable about just how much stuff is weighing down the planet, and that there's already enough clothes to dress all of us, and obviously all of this was secondhand, let alone the new production. And then as I went on to study fashion at uni, around the time of the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013, which was still the largest industrial disaster in fashion history, I started to, again, really question what role I wanted to play in the industry, and potentially not going down that traditional path of working with brands, but trying to be part of the solution. But I think it is quite a long journey. It's not just one light bulb moment, because we all are so, transfixed in consumerism, etc. But I think once you start to feel that discomfort, that cognitive dissonance maybe, it's very hard to turn back from that point.
I feel like seeing everything, like you said, in that warehouse is just different to seeing it all on an app or website on ASOS or anything, because we're so used to that, but we don't physically see all these clothes. It's just like an image online.
Yeah, and it just made me realize, as young designers, studying fashion or going into the fashion industry, why make anything new? Why not upcycle? Why not use what already exists? Is this amazing resource that we have, all these clothes on Earth? And just made me realize, why are we even making new fabrics at all? We've got enough clothes to dress ourselves a million times over. So as well as it being a kind of negative realization, it was like, hang on, this is actually, an opportunity.
Yeah. What about you, Shanice? Did you have the light bulb moment?
To be fair, I think my moment mainly came when I started watching more documentaries, doing more research, and just realizing the actual process involved in the sense of creating fashion, creating clothing itself, the whole production of it, and just seeing the amount of toxins that are released, seeing that they're destroying people's but particularly in third world countries, not necessarily here, destroying their water sources, affecting the fertility of their land. And then, as you mentioned, just the sheer amount of clothing, and seeing that we're producing a large amount of clothing, and most of it ends up in landfills or being exported to other countries, and it's not even usable in that sense. Most of it is quite poor quality, most of it ends up being burnt, most of it is non-biodegradable, partly because we just don't have the technology to actually work with fabrics once they're in that state. So I think those were the main areas where I started to realise that just because the consequences are exported in other areas of the world doesn't mean there isn't any. And I think especially now with globalization, where we're realizing how connected we are with the rest of the world, I think we're becoming more conscious of our impact, in the sense of, even as consumers, when we're buying things, realizing that it has a knock-on effect somewhere else. And I feel like now we're becoming more conscious of it. So I'll say that was
documentaries. I can see that. I feel like I recently watched a documentary, I won't say what it's about, and it was just about a fast fashion label, and it's seeing it. It's something that's far away, and seeing it and just having that education about what's going on, that is scary, I think. We had a nod here over to a documentary. So what about you, Lottie?
Yeah, I was going to say it's hard to pinpoint a moment, and I guess I'll be honest, for me, always loved shopping in charity shops. I've always loved dressing secondhand, whether that's rooting through my grandma's attic but it was initially always like for the thrill of like finding, you know, that treasure or like getting a bargain. It was never like initially on my radar, if I'm honest. And then it was probably only like later on when I was at around the time I was at university, probably not long after the Rana Plaza disaster, there was a documentary, I think it was The True Cost, and it was seeing that, you know, the scale of the amount of clothing that gets dumped in landfills, that for me was like, oh, okay, which is like, yeah, takes it to a whole new level of why I now shop secondhand. Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely just, it's the visual impact of it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I think, I feel like when secondhand has gone from that thrill of getting a bargain and saving money to like, actually this has like a dual benefit, because it's, especially during the cost of living crisis, it is helping people save money, but it's massively helping the environment as well. Yeah. Amelia, what about you? What was your moment?
I'm going to echo, I think, what a lot of you said, which is about that journey. I grew up on an organic farm, so from very, very young I had an awareness of sustainability, and it was always was the kind of context in which like everything I understood about the world existed in. But there was definitely a moment, I think in about 2017, when I realised, it wasn't that I realised that there was a need for more sustainability in fashion, but it was just that the industry was just lagging behind other industries. I worked in food, sustainability and food systems for years, and that the narrative around that was just increasing, and the pace was getting faster and faster, or let's say louder and louder rather. But the fashion industry was kind of just dragging its heels, and there was like an initiative here, a kind of mention there, you know, such brands would have their conscious ranges which would do X, Y and Z, but it would be like this little bit, you know, there in the store. And so I was kind of just waiting for that moment when it would really just get a kick up its arse and like start moving. Yeah. And it just didn't. I just thought it was going so slowly, and that was the moment I was like, well, I need to, with no background in fashion, move into that space and try and get it to move faster, because it was that was what really concerned me. It was just the slow pace at which it was taking action.
And do you think, and this is to all of you, do you think, you're talking about your penny drop moments, society in itself has had a penny drop moment about the industry? Has that come? Is it coming now? Do you think it's about to come in the future, or do you think it's still, people are still lagging behind and potentially not realising the impact of their wardrobes?
I think the penny might have dropped, but the behaviour change hasn't happened yet. I think the action hasn't. I mean, you can see certain trajectories and certain trends, like the resale market's going boom at the moment, but we're obviously still seeing the industry producing more and more and more and looking at growth, and that's obviously being fed to some extent by the people buying the clothing. So I think the shift hasn't quite happened yet in enough of a dramatic sense that we need it to.
I was gonna say, I guess that's where like the greenwashing element comes in, and like everyone's got great intentions, and I myself have definitely been fooled by companies using those like conscious tags, you know, those like buzzwords.
And just a green label.
Yeah.
And it just looking a bit different, the label looking different, yeah.
So I think, yeah, even though we as customers have the best intentions, sometimes it's just not fully understanding what that is.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, I think we are becoming more aware. I think especially with just the growing awareness of just climate change overall, and everyone's becoming more conscious, and their willingness to actually contribute to kind of reducing our carbon footprint and our impact on the environment. Yeah. But I think more so, the information that's available is, unless you know about it, then you know, and if you don't, you just kind of don't. And I feel like people want to contribute towards a positive change, but are not completely aware of how to do that. I also feel like because of the lack of transparency in the fashion industry overall, people might feel like they're doing really well when they're going out and they're trying to be more conscious, and they see the label and they're buying those kind of items. But in the sense of seeing, you know, the amount that I'm spending on this particular item, how much is the person being paid that actually made it? That information we don't know unless you go looking for it. So I feel like we have good intentions, but it's more so just finding it difficult to actually have a good impact with the actions we're doing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Because sometimes people aren't aware.
Yeah.
We've touched on this, When you hear the phrase sustainable fashion, I'm going to come to you, Ruth. What does that mean to you? And do you think that phrase has sort of become overused? Because we're talking about the sort of like conscious labels and ranges. And when people want to shop more sustainably, potentially they're not doing it because they don't know the impact of what they're buying. What does true sustainable fashion, what would you say it means?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Our co-founder, Ursula de Castro, always says it shouldn't be sustainable fashion and fashion. It should be fashion and unsustainable fashion. We need to move towards the narrative where fashion is good by default and everything that's not is unsustainable, because those of us that really truly love fashion and believe it can be a force for good, we want that to be in the message of fashion itself. So it's really hard, I think, to define sustainable fashion, because we really should shift it onto any brand that's not doing the right thing, any product, that's made in exploitative conditions. We shouldn't count that as part of the mainstream fashion industry. It should be, it should be absolutely, condemned. And I think the way that we're going to get there is not through consumers making good choices, pushing through the greenwashing messages, but by removing those unsustainable options altogether. And we're only going to get there through legislation, through policy change, through laws that make those exploitative conditions and the environmental destruction just illegal. Because I don't think any of us, when we want to buy something, want our purchase to fund, somebody else's unhappiness. I don't think anyone wants that.
No.
But the pressure shouldn't be on us to be able to decipher all of these marketing messages and complex terms. You have to go to, study science and climate change and fashion tech to understand sometimes, We shouldn't have to make that choice. We should know, in the same way that when we buy food, we expect it to be safe. When we buy a car, we expect it to be tested thoroughly. Fashion's just a wild west. Every week there's new stories about lead being found in clothing to this day in 2022. So I really think reframing the conversation around sustainable fashion needs to be not about, oh, this would be nice to have if we had some more sustainable brands or whatever, but actually we need to transform the whole system so that sustainable is the default. I know that's not a real answer as to what sustainable fashion is, but I think we really need to get a bit more kind of bold and urgent with our questioning of these terms, instead of sustainable fashion being a niche or a nice to have.
Yeah, I like that, sustainable fashion being the default. So it wouldn't even be called sustainable fashion, it would be the fashion industry. Yeah. As the Sustainable Fashion Week UK, Amelia, obviously this is completely within your remit. What would you say about the phrase sustainable fashion, or what Ruth said?
I think it's really problematic.
Yeah.
And when we were, or when I was thinking about the name for Sustainable Fashion Week, I was thinking, God, I don't know how to make it so that it does what it says on the tin, so people, as broad an audience as possible, people from all backgrounds can look at those words and understand what we're talking about broadly. But whilst also acknowledging that there is no such thing as sustainable fashion in a definable term. There's nothing which actually defines it. So what we did was we defined it ourselves. So we used Sustainable Fashion Week so that broadly we could include people broadly, all audiences, because they'd get what we were talking about. But what we say is it's a sustainable fashion industry be one that does no harm, is based on a culture of exchange, and is fueled by collective action. So we've defined it ourselves. Like, I think it's problematic, but that's why we were like, right, I'm going to put in writing what this actually means to us.
Yeah. And I mean, would you say, and this is an open question to all of you, pre-loved fashion is sustainable fashion? Secondhand clothes are sustainable?
I think extending the life of a garment that already exists is going to be sustainable. Keeping that in circularity, and flying the flag for charity shops. It's an affordable option for many when looking at brands that are looking at different technologies and recycled fabrics that might be a bit pricier than shopping in a charity shop is an accessible way to shop consciously. But I think with you still need to kind of, going back to the brands that are donated to charity shops, I think, like you're saying, it can't be fully sustainable unless, you know, the people that make those garments are paid a living wage. And, you know, just my hope is that going forward, the donations that come over the door to charity shops are better quality, because the sheer amount of clothes that get donated that aren't saleable, that have, you know, that do end up in landfill still via the rag trade, you know, is hopefully that's going to reduce by doing, you know, those things that we were talking about. So yeah, hopefully that's what's going to happen.
And what makes a garment or a piece of clothing not resellable in a charity shop? Because I feel like a lot of people, when you're clearing out your wardrobes and you take it to charity, a lot of people would assume that all of those clothes go to the charity shop, but I've read more over the past few years of charity shops specifically trying to say these clothes we might not sell. But what makes a garment unsellable? Or
I think donate what you would be prepared to buy. I think that's a simple way of putting it. And I know that lots of charity shops now are like honing in on skills, like volunteer skills that might be able to upcycle items. So just because the button's missing or a zip's broken, then, you know, that can definitely be sold on, and that can definitely be used in a charity shop. I'm talking about like whether it's soiled, whether it's you know, an unwashed item that a poor volunteer has to kind of sift through. We can't accept volunteers to go through, you know, those, you know, sort of bad quality.
Yeah.
So yeah, but donate what you would be prepared to buy yourself.
Yeah.
And speak to your local charity shops what they would accept, because like I said, some charities are great at hosting upcycling events and would take things that others might not. So I guess it's just having those conversations with your local charity shop to see what they would deem acceptable.
Yeah, and knowing you can have those conversations and
that
you don't just have to go in and but you can learn more about their stock as well.
Yeah.
When I volunteered at a charity shop when I was a teenager, the stuff people would send in with stains on it, it's kind of disrespectful because again, like, people rely on charity shops for an affordable way to clothe themselves and their children. So to send something that you're just like, oh, I don't know what to do with this, somebody else can have it. It's like a sign of disrespect, and then obviously that has the knock-on effect of those clothes being exported to other countries where we expect, oh, they should just be grateful for these clothes because they're clothes, but we should expect that everybody else wants to wear the same quality of clothing that we want to wear ourselves. And like you say, it should go back to the brands themselves that are creating the new things in the first place. How much longevity do those new things have in the resale system? Because if we are moving towards a circular fashion system, which I hope we are, it needs to start at the design stage.
Yeah.
Is this a really trend-led item that's just not going to be desirable in even 6 months' time? Are the seams good enough to last? Like, just these really basic things that should be taught at the design level. We need to think about that if we want to build this circular system that's actually viable. And obviously we see brands now going into resale, which, you know, I have mixed feelings about the kind of commodification of that. But fast fashion, or even sometimes luxury fashion, is not good enough quality to really last several cycles of resale, upcycling, recycling. So we really need to go back to the fundamentals of fashion being quality, durable, able to be adjusted and upcycled in different ways. Because I shop at charity shops most of the time too, and I think over the years I have seen the quality go down in what you're finding in the likes of, you know, the super fast online retailers are kind of overtaking charity shops now, and I don't want to spend, you know, £10 on a secondhand fast fashion item that's just not going to last. So we really need to think as consumers, but also as brands and designers, you know, what would we buy ourselves, and kind of have that respect and dignity too.
I think the fact they link like secondhand fashion plus like buying new, like it's becoming clear in my head that they are linked. Like, it's not just buying secondhand is completely sustainable, because you can't just donate anything to a charity shop, and like you said. But what I was going to ask, and I think is interesting, is that the future of fashion, I think, couldn't necessarily just be secondhand, because if we stopped buying new, that is a lot of people around the world losing jobs and losing income. So what is the potential solution to that? Is it truly sustainable fashion lines, or is it, like you said, starting right at the design stage and ensuring that from there these clothes are durable and can last more lifetimes, I'm guessing?
And I think as well, just putting more of an emphasis on what is the functionality of clothing, what is the purpose for why we actually need clothes. I think the issue has come now, especially when we have like hauls, when you will see on like YouTube Shorts or on Instagram, when people are reviewing items, they're not necessarily reviewing the functionality or the practicality of that piece of clothing, but it's more so the experience of buying something. So when they're unwrapping it, they're just unwrapping all these pieces of paper and they're showing you an item in its most prestige state, and it's unworn, and this is good and this is perfect. And that's, we're now encouraged to buy, not because we need it, not because it's practical, not because it's functional, but simply just for the experience of shopping. So I think now it's just more so building more of an awareness of why we are consuming clothes, why we need it. And I think that would help us to find a balance between, one, we need to produce less, and we also need to consume less. And I think by us putting a greater emphasis on clothing being practical, functional, being able to last and be reused and durable, that will help us to kind of combat the issues that we are facing, in the sense of having clothing that are poor quality, that are difficult to resell on, that, you know, we can't even, people are not even willing to buy them. Charity shops end up having to just throw them away, export them somewhere else. So I think if we do that, I think that would help us to be able to combat that issue.
Yeah. And as someone who shops secondhand, would you say what you've noticed in charity shops, or the way you shop secondhand, whether that's on apps or things, has changed since you've been doing it?
100%. I think what I've realised, when I was younger, I actually used to shop at charity shops more because the quality was really good. But now I actually shop more so on apps such as Vinted or eBay, because what I find is that I can get a higher quality of clothing, but for so much cheaper. So that's more of the draw in that way. And I found that the clothes are more durable. I can actually afford to buy things that I just need, and just essential pieces, whereas before I would have to buy an essential piece, but it wouldn't necessarily be durable and I'll be getting rid of it within a year. Now I'm just like, even if I had something in my wardrobe that I didn't particularly like anymore, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to resell that on, and then I can buy something else to replace it. Or if, especially when it comes to like occasion item pieces. So for myself, if I'm going to like a wedding or something like that, I might have to get a piece, and if I did, then something I've started to do is just hire those pieces out, because they're so much better quality that I can afford to do that, and people will use them, give them back to me, and I can give it on to someone else, or I can just actually get rid of my whole wardrobe that is stuck with all these pieces, and ensure that I'm not stockpiling and just overly consuming. I think what I do like about shopping, particularly secondhand and pre-loved, is that I don't always feel the pressure. I don't feel the pressure to consume, because when I look at clothes, it's not that they're in their most prestige state. I'm just looking at it and I'm like, oh, okay, do I actually need a warm jumper? I just need it to be warm. So I think that's what
it's not dressed up with the nice packaging. I understand what you mean about it being the experience of buying brand new, because you don't get that in charity shops. Although charity shops more, since I've been going, there's Mary's Living and Giving, which is, you feel like it's an experience.
And I think, like, just building on what Shanice is saying, like, I think for that reason, with so many apps available now, it's important to, you know, to make charity shops cool again, so you want to go and visit them physically, and to make them more experiential. So I designed the Mary's Living and Giving shops, and I think just it's that reason for someone to go out and spend time in there, like treating them more as community spaces, to host events, to like collaborate with different people in the community, and, you know, to really act as like community hubs, which again is keeping those clothes within that community, which again is reducing carbon emissions too, because you are, you know, all the the clothing that you're donating is staying local, it's staying. So yeah, which is why I love when I go on holiday, the first thing I do is look for the nearest charity shop because I often find that, like, you know, depending where you are, I love to see like what people donate in that area.
Yeah.
And, like, you can tell so much about an area through like what's in the charity shops.
Yeah.
And like going back to the quality, like it's definitely the oldest, the older stock in there that tends to be the better quality, which is just a testament to it stood the test of time. So yeah, my favourite buys have always been, you know, like proper vintage, you know, stuff that you'd find in your grandma's attic, which is really well made. So yeah.
So have you ever been anywhere on holiday where you've gone into a charity shop and what you've seen has been completely different to something you've seen in the UK or where you live?
So sorry, I should have said when I was referring to like staycations. So yeah, different places in the UK. I mean, I love shopping up north because it's cheaper. So that's the main thing. My mum's a charity shop manager, and she always just sifts me all the good stuff. You can want this, do you want this? But have I noticed anything different? I mean, like, we recently went to the Lake District and I needed a new, like, I didn't pack a cagoule, and yeah, all the charity shops there are full of like outdoorsy wear, which is perfect. And I was listening to, I've forgotten what podcast it was, but someone like mentioned, had such a great tip, and I thought that's such a great shout. You want to pack light for somewhere, if you're going on a staycation, then just rock up to the nearest charity shop, you know, get your outfit from there and then donate it back before you go back, which I thought, that's such a good idea for like travelling lighter.
That's a good tip.
I'd love to just jump in on the point you raised before about, okay, if we all shop secondhand all the time, you know, what's going to happen to I think it's about 75 million people that work in garment and textile production right now. And this is an issue that we're like very, very concerned about at Fashion Revolution, because we listen to workers, unions, worker representatives who are totally on board for the transition towards, you know, net zero, and you know, they know themselves because they make the clothes that there's just too much out there. But ultimately their jobs do depend on production of new clothing. So what we really need to see is brands and retailers who are making these commitments to, okay, we're going to cut our carbon emissions by 50%. How are you going to support your supply chain to do that? How are you going to invest in those workers being retrained in, you know, recycling, upcycling, repair? You know, how are you going to facilitate that transition for those workers so that they're not left behind? Because even though I will always say we should all consume less, what we saw during the pandemic was people did consume less, and that had a very negative knock-on effect to those workers. So, you know, we're having a lot of conversations with these major brands and retailers about just transition, about, you know, reducing their production, but not abandoning those workers when they do that. So I think although we should be buying secondhand, I think there's also merit in the brands that we do buy from new, continuing to question them and to pressure them to look after their workers, to support brands that we really do believe in and that do look after their workers. And yeah, just to keep that pressure on, as well as, you know, embracing the joy of secondhand.
And to know that that process is happening, because it's not, I can imagine it won't be a quick solution for these brands to sort of go down their supply chain and see what's going on. What would you say, Amelia, about that sort of the versus not buying new and secondhand and the sort of impact it can have?
I would really echo what you're saying, Ruth, about I think we need to, the big often elephant in the room is degrowth and how we manage consuming less, because we know that with the planetary boundaries we're working within, there is an absolute fundamental limit to how much we can produce and consume before, you know, our environment becomes unlivable. So we have to consume less and we have to produce less. And I think often in the context of fashion and fast fashion, so many brands have used garment workers as a kind of weapon in that conversation, saying, well, if you consume less, look who's going to suffer. And it makes me so angry, because I feel like, well, even though as consumers the human rights of the people who produce our clothing, we're inextricably linked to those human rights, but we're not responsible for how the system works. You know, we're as much victims of it as consumers as the people who produce our clothing, but the people who benefit by exploiting consumers and exploiting the supply chain is the brand. And so it's the brand's responsibility, just like you're saying, to really put their profit into managing degrowth and looking at how they can support the transition for garment workers, for farmers as well. Like, they're often, I think, unseen in the conversation around fashion. And having come from a farming background, that's always where I go to, is like, how are you going to support cotton farmers who produce, 22% of the world's fibre? How are we going to support them in that transition? But almost the fact that we're having a conversation about it isn't quite right, because the people who should be, the conversation needs to happen where the money is, and the money is with the brands.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's just not black and white. It's not easy I'm thinking for consumers. It's so nuanced in terms of the decisions that people can make. And I think it's education and hearing from people in industries like yours to learn more about, like what you said, and where the issues should start, and obviously who should be making the decisions. But I feel sometimes consumers are a bit like, they feel the weight of choice.
It's
like
overwhelming, isn't it?
Yeah, like what can I do?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, like, definitely educating ourselves. I mean, I could like pick your brains, and learn so much. There's so much I don't know, and I think that's the one thing that we as consumers can just to hold those brands to account, is to just keep educating ourselves. Yeah.
And I guess education is where it started when a lot of you said, I watched a documentary and X, Y, Z, and then you learn more. It's where you start to get that, oh, hang on, something's not right. And then whenever I watch a documentary, I'll Google it, and then I'm like Googling it more and then going into it. And then I find myself at the end just scrolling, trying to find out more. But if education is one aspect, what other things do you think consumers can do to try and ensure their wardrobe or the clothes they buy or the shopping they do is more sustainable or better for the planet?
I think one thing is not giving into the pressure of just buying trendy items that are just on trend.
Yeah.
I think mainly focusing on buying like essential, durable pieces that you can continuously wear, restyle, upuse, give to someone else, those kind of pieces. I think even things like, so recently I found that in my local area, they're actually doing a course on like mending clothing and stuff. So today I would just do that so that if like my jumper broke or something, like, well, I got a little tear in my jumper or something, I could just simply sew it back together. So I think mainly focusing on ways in which we can keep clothing longer, making it more durable. And I think as consumers, just being aware of the mounting pressure to always buy something new, like through advertisement, through marketing, especially just being online, that we are the ones they're trying to encourage to buy. And I think also realizing that as consumers, we do have a level of power in the situation, and that they're trying to feed our demand. So if our demand changes, then they will also have to adjust to us. So I think little things like that.
I'm feeling the pressure with all the sparkly stuff for Christmas.
Especially
it's everywhere.
Everywhere.
And it's just like you said, that it's like there's a reason. Like, I really love sparkly things, and I'm like going into my local charity shop or looking on Vinted like long sparkly dresses for Christmas. But that's a really good point, that sometimes we're oblivious to what the pressures are coming towards us, and we feel like we have to do it.
And to be fair, if you want your something sparkly, like, okay, I'm going to this particular event, then you could be like, okay, I'm just going to hire a sparkly dress or something, and know that you can give it on and someone else is going to use it. There's good things.
Definitely. I was going to say 3 R's is what I always go to, that reuse, reduce, and then recycle. And again, like the pressure, I mean, I've particularly found it this year. I had a little girl earlier in the year, and like it's a whole different ball game in terms of the pressure I feel to buy new things for her all the time. And because it's a new thing for me, I'm like, oh, does she need this? Does she need this toy? Like, am I a bad parent if I don't get her that? And I just got, I can just got around like my wardrobe and like resisting the pull of fast fashion brands, but with her, it's like and because they grow out of things so quickly. But one thing that is so great where I live in Crystal Palace, there's like such a community of sharing and like passing things on, and I think that's the thing. It's just like working together as a community. I just joined like a Facebook group where people, you know, as well as Facebook Marketplace, but it's that constant like rotation of baby clothes going around in Crystal Palace, which just makes perfect sense because you might only need it for a month.
Yeah, that's the thing. We haven't even touched on like kids, but they grow out stuff so quickly. When you get to like a certain age, you are of a similar size, potentially over years,
exactly.
but not with kids.
No. So yeah, that's definitely been an eye opener for sure.
What would you say, Ruth, about sort of what consumers can do to like not give in to the pressure that is surrounding us?
Yeah, there is a lot of pressure right now. On the train here, I saw a Black Friday advert where the Black Friday sale was not just on Black Friday, but for the entire month of November, which is just mad. But I guess I would say beyond just consumption, whether you're consuming something good or not consuming something bad, I think it's important to remember that it's not just your money that you spend or don't spend, it's your voice. So Fashion Revolution, we really encourage people to use their voice on social media and offline to ask brands questions like who made my clothes, who made my fabric, what's in my clothes, demanding greater transparency as to how those clothes are made, the impact that they have, and how they're meeting those targets that they talk about so much. And also you as a consumer have the power to influence, you know, the laws that will eventually regulate the fashion industry too. So right now we're running a petition called Good Clothes Fair Pay, and as a citizen you can sign that petition, and it's calling on the EU to legislate on living wages in the fashion industry. So these are like real quick actions that you can take that will have a real life impact for millions of garment workers around the world. So think beyond just your wardrobe and also think about what can you do to change the system, and you actually, as you said, you do have power as a consumer.
It is so big, isn't it, that it is like, you've just sort of put it into perspective for me, that it is beyond just the shops we shop at and the charity shops and what's in our wardrobe, because like you said, using your voice and being part of this conversation and listening to discussions like this and learning more could make a difference over just what you buy that day, for example. What about you, Amelia? What would you say?
Or just following on from what you're saying, I think so our third thing about that I mentioned earlier about how we define sustainable fashion is fueled by collective action. So thinking beyond yourself, I think is really important, because as we all feel that individual pressure, like how can we as an individual, no matter if we have the most just and sustainable wardrobe that we've created and had really good choices in putting that together, it will have such a little impact individually, but if we work collectively, that impact will be so much more amplified and have bigger platform. And so activism, I think, is a huge part of that. Like even if we are changing our habits, if we then feed into big campaigns, push policymakers to make change, I think that's a really important thing, but also acting in our communities as well. Like if we share mending skills, if we share clothing, if we do things like having clothing swaps and work in our kind of local networks, I think that has real power as well, because then you've got this kind of strength in numbers, which makes you feel like you've got access to sustainability through different entry points. You don't need a big budget to do that. You feel like you know how to become an activist because you've got someone that you're working with next door, let's say, who's helping you find those petitions to sign or helping you write an email to your MP. So I think, like as citizens, like if we take a stand together and if we act collectively, I think we'll all feel more powerful and a little bit less overwhelmed by the kind of, you know, enormity of what needs to happen.
And it's like with a lot of issues, isn't it? That collective action, it comes up a lot, and it does, having people that sort of are feeling this and having the same thoughts you're having, coming together to try and make a change can feel comforting to know that you're not at home thinking, oh, my wardrobe's just awful. What do? I really want that sparkly dress. There are other people who have the similar thoughts and potentially have ideas of ways to do things about it.
Yeah.
So one thing I thought when we sort of discussed this talk was just talking about secondhand. And one question I want to propose to you, which I don't know whether we can answer, but is for someone that is thinking secondhand clothing is the way to go, is second clothing the future? Is pre-loved fashion the future? What would you say, open to anyone?
you have to turn the tap off at the same time. That's because it's all part of one bigger conversation, and in circularity is where all the focus is at the moment on extended producer responsibility. But if you're not turning that tap off, it's just feeding the problem in a way. But I think pre-loved is, I think it was someone who works at Fashion Revolution, Verity Jones, she said that, and I'm going to get this wrong because I always get my stats wrong, but broadly, I think there's enough clothing on the planet now to clothe the next 3 generations, is that right? So if we stop producing any clothing today, we'd have enough for, and what's the generation, 20 years odd?
I've heard 100 years. We've got enough to last us 100 years.
Okay, that's
but
better
I would
then.
guess even more than that.
I think, yeah, it must be.
Yeah.
So I think we have to have this big conversation around degrowth, around the brands taking action now to reduce, and then around absolutely massively ramping up pre-loved, because that is obviously, because we have to, because if we don't do that, then it's all just going to go to landfill or end up in Ghana or Chile. So I think pre-loved is a huge part of the solution. And one last thing I'll say is it has to be accessible. So obviously with the rise in the resale market, we're seeing prices go up. Charity shops are really expensive.
Yeah.
Why would somebody go to a charity shop and spend £12 on a second-hand dress when they can go to Primark and buy one for cheaper? And have choice. So how can we ensure that everyone can participate in the changes that are going to happen in fashion, rather than just changing the system a bit and having it still be inaccessible and too exclusive for lots and lots of people who obviously get dressed every morning.
I would say as well that even though secondhand is a really amazing way in, and I think for me, like I said, my first job at the vintage warehouse, it was what I was doing anyway, and then you find out about, you know, the potential environmental benefits as well. But also fashion is about creativity, it's about innovation, it's about heritage and craft and history, and there are so many amazing young designers from the global south, small brands and small businesses that are producing very small quantities. You know, they have their values embedded in those things they make. We shouldn't abandon that either. And I think it brings me a lot of joy to have most of my wardrobe secondhand, but then the occasional piece or the occasional thing that I've saved up for, that I have met the designer personally, that I know I'm supporting a small business that's linked to maybe a small farm. I think there's so much positive stuff going on in fashion right now, and I think these conversations are good to have to remind you that, you know, the solutions are out there. There's small businesses that are already putting these ideas into practice, that they're walking the walk. So I think I love the idea of complementing secondhand with those designers who often are making things out of old things, upcycling. There's so much out there, and I'd really recommend taking a look at our initiative Fashion Open Studio, which supports those young designers, and looking beyond just maybe London brands or UK brands, but also looking elsewhere.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And like the principle of that reuse, reduce and recycle doesn't just apply to us as consumers, it applies to those, to brands, and you know, the excitement is not the new trend, is what is exciting to kind of what can we create with what we've got. So yeah, I agree.
So in 50 years' time, I'm going to come to you, Shanice, as the last question. 50 years' time, we're 2072. What would you like to see the fashion industry, what would you like to see it being like?
I think a big thing would, one, be a greater level of transparency, especially in like the supply chain, especially around how much workers are being paid when it comes to our clothing, for us to have a confidence of knowing that our clothes are produced ethically, to know that it is sustainable, and to know that we can wear them and value them. I think another thing would be to know that they can be passed on, that our clothes can actually endure the test of time, and to know that you can confidently buy clothes without even having to think twice about, is this going to be done in a week or two. I think another thing that would be really good is for us to be able to have the technology to be able to appropriately recycle clothing toward the end of their life cycle. So being able to find ways of repurposing, recycling it, and to ethically dispose of those clothes, and to find ways to find different uses for our clothes when they end, and to also see that it's all of us that are championing it all together, that it's not necessarily just people that love secondhand or people that have just a great passion or interest in fashion, but to see that everyone acknowledges that we all have a part to play in saving our planet together, and we all can take collective action that all works to deal with the issue at hand. Because I feel like sometimes it just feels like there's just a small pocket of people that realise there's an issue, or small, well, not small, we're actually a pretty big business, but so there's actually big businesses out there that acknowledge that, wow, and charities, that it is important. But to see that we all have an awareness of it and that we can all contribute to it. So I think that would be...
Because we all get dressed every morning,
Exactly.
don't we? So we are all part of it.
Yeah, and I feel like what you said, it's like we're getting there. There are steps. We're not there, and gosh, there's a long way to go, but it's encouraging that this conversation is not new, and it's being had more, and we're seeing it more, and there are more documentaries, and give me more documentaries, but it is becoming more mainstream, and I think let's hope for Shanice's 27-22 prediction. But thank you all so much. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for sharing your insights. It's been a joy.
Thank you so much.